Okay, welcome back. This is our last session of today on the data management practices track. So don't forget to visit the keynote at the end of day. I'm Aldous Carlos Carloskis, and I remind that I'm also the founder of the community Techies of Baltics. I'll post a link in the chat during Michael's talk so you can find where's that if you're interested. But then I understand Michael from Andromeda Galactic Solutions is going to show us, teach us a little how in easy ways to truly get your CI/CD up and running. That's how I see it. Let's see, am I right or not? Michael,
Yep.
over to you. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining me today. We're going to talk about code automation CI/CD with Bitbucket in Bitbucket pipelines. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. Again, my name is Michael Dowden. I operate Andromeda Galactic Solutions, which is a software product development agency here in the United States. I've been making software for about 30 years, and this talk comes from my experience in setting up automation for some of our current projects. One of the important forms of DevOps automation, of course, is the CI/CD, which represents some of the following concepts. You have your continuous integration, where you're constantly merging code together. You have your continuous deployment, where you're always moving code out into some sort of environment, and your continuous delivery in front of your clients and customers. You may have used one of these other tools for CI/CD in the past as well. In fact, a lot of my prior experience with CI/CD was with Jenkins. I did a lot with Jenkins for a number of years before moving over to Bitbucket pipelines. But as you know, we're talking about Bitbucket. So pipelines are built into every Bitbucket account, and they make it easy to add automation to your software projects. I'm going to talk to you about how to get started and some specific examples that I have found useful. Some of these aren't immediately obvious when you're still learning, and as often happens, the pipelines are very useful to solve complex problems, but the documentation is often too simple to really immediately figure out how to implement some of the things you want to do. So this talk's going to be kind of like a cookbook. There's going to be some specific scenarios, and we're going to walk through the configuration and code required to make those different things happen. So this is a sample ecosystem that closely resembles the one that I work and live in every day. We use Atlassian tools for our project management, our documentation, and collaboration. Our code is managed with Git using Bitbucket, and then we use pipelines to handle a wide range of tasks, many of which included moving code and apps out to other platforms, such as Firebase hosting, AWS, Heroku, GitHub, etc. So pipelines run in response to events that happen within your Git repository. And the configuration for the pipeline itself lives within the repository. The pipeline configuration is written in YAML, and the runtime environment of the pipeline is determined by Docker and is run on Atlassian's cloud infrastructure provided by AWS. All of my pipelines run on Linux and take advantage of standard shell scripts, but one of the things we're going to use a lot is the web console. And so let's start by taking a quick look at that. So this is an example of a pipeline screen in the web console. This is a standard Bitbucket layout. You'll note that the pipeline exists within the repository, along with the source branches and pull requests. So on the pipeline page, there are a few actions along the top. You have this Run Pipeline button. It allows you to manually run any pipeline defined for your repository. Schedules, which allow you to schedule a pipeline to run every hour, day, or a week. And then caches, which show you the state of your pipeline caches. Mine is currently showing an alert on this screenshot. So if we click on one of the successful pipelines, so if I come down here and click on one of these, we're going to see the following screen. It shows the details of all the tasks that were performed for the pipeline, the setup, the NPM, the linting, testing, building, and then the teardown. It shows that the related branch is over here. We have a bunch of things here, pull request, related pull request. We have the JIRA issue that was associated with it right here, as well as any pipeline details, including who ran the job, when it was run, how long it took, and which pipeline it was that ran. And so we see that pipeline information down here. The various task steps can be expanded to show extra details. So here we've expanded the npm run test step, and it includes console output so that we can go see what's going on in either a successful or a failing build. Failing tests can actually show up as a separate tab here between this build and artifact step. You'll end up with a test tab there that shows details about the test failures. Any artifacts that are produced by your pipeline will show up under the artifacts tab, and they will remain there for 2 weeks. This means that if you use pipelines to perform a build, your built code lives out there. It's usually out there in a zip archive. You can download it. You can look at it locally, make sure that the files look the way you expect them to. You can run them on your system. And those will remain out there for a couple of weeks if you need to go back to an older build and figure out what was going on. So it's a really useful tool for troubleshooting failing builds or build issues. So let's look at how to create an initial pipeline. So as I mentioned, a pipeline file is in YAML. Specifically, it has the file name bitbucket-pipelines.yml, and it should be located in the root directory of your repository. So this pipeline is an example from one of my projects. It is a default pipeline, which means because it says pipeline's default, it means that it will run on every single branch that gets pushed to Bitbucket unless that branch specifies its own rules later on in this file. In this case, it simply runs linting and unit tests. That's what the scripts are down below in that first step. If linting and tests fail, it'll generate a notification to our development team, and we configure that through the web console, what the behaviors are on successful and failing tests. This works like other things in Bitbucket where you can decide what events within Bitbucket send a notification for my team that ends up going directly into Slack. So if there's another thing that happens with a failing pipeline is it will show up as an error on any of your pull requests. So if you create a pull request on a branch that has a failing pipeline, you're going to see that right there on the pull request, and this will help you prevent accidentally merging code that is failing some of your preliminary checks. For example, the linting and testing here. The other thing that we see in this file right up at the top line is the image. So let's talk about that for just a second. Bitbucket uses Docker to define the runtime environment, and the image option allows us to specify the Docker image that we want to use to run the pipeline. We can provide the name of any public Docker image from Docker Hub along with the image version. So this specific one is a Linux image that contains everything you need to build and run node projects. So it's the node Docker image specific version 17.1.0, and the version number is tied to node versions. Sometimes, though, you want to use your own private images without publishing them to the world. Pipelines support that as well and allow you to use variables for the sensitive details without hard coding them into your configuration. So in this particular case, I can provide the account and image along with any version if necessary, and then the credentials necessary to get me into Docker Hub to pull that private image. Also, you can pull Docker images out of AWS. So if you have an AWS account, you can provide those details in the name and then provide any access credentials necessary through variables here. Now, since Bitbucket uses Docker to, whoops, we did that already. So let's go into here. Here's where we go to the repository variables. So one of the things we saw here is we've got this $sign AWS access key. That's just a variable. And we can add those variables right here inside of the Cloud Console. So inside of your repository, go to Settings, Pipelines, Repository Variables. You can then add your variables here on this screen. If you want them to remain hidden, in other words, you don't want anybody else to be able to see that password or that credential, click that secured box and it will keep that masked out for other users of the system. This way, an administrator can come in here. They can set up tokens and passwords to all the different remote systems you need to be able to connect to, but your developers still have the access necessary to configure pipelines and publish code as appropriate. So this is the way you do that and maintain those secrets. After pushing your pipelines, your Bitbucket pipelines YAML file for the very first time, you may need to enable pipelines in the console. And you can do that again by going to the repository settings and then pipelines and settings, as you can see here, and simply move that slider over to the right to enable the pipelines. After that, every time you commit code to your repository, the pipelines will run. There's additionally a few configuration options inside of your pipelines. In addition to the image, one option that can be useful is max time. In other words, if there's a maximum amount of time that you want your pipeline to run, you can specify that here. For example, if you have a job that is sometimes not terminating correctly, and you want it to be force terminated at a specific point, you put the max time here. Now, there is a max time by default. I don't remember off the top of my head what the default max time is, but if the default doesn't work, you can specify this here. I believe the default is quite long. So if you have jobs that are either longer than that or shorter than that, and you want to have a definitive time, put this option in here. The other thing that can happen is every once in a while, you may end up in a situation where you need more memory to be able to run a specific step or a specific job inside of the pipelines. If I remember correctly, by default, it is 4 gigabytes of memory available. That is not always enough. In fact, one of my projects absolutely will not build within 4 gigabytes. So what you can do there is inside of the step, there is a size option. This here is a 2x size option. That means that we're allocating 8 gigabytes of memory for this step to run. And another useful thing that's very, very helpful if you're trying to troubleshoot memory issues is this script here, while true, do echo memory usage in bytes, and it shows you how to print out all of what your actual in-memory usage is while the pipeline is running. And just every few seconds, it's every 20 seconds, it's going to print out what that memory usage is. It's going to show up in the logs within the Bitbucket console so that I can come back later whether the job succeeded or failed, and I can see every 20 seconds how much memory was in use at that point in time. And that can be really useful because, like in my situation, everything ran and built perfectly on my system, and it didn't look like it was using more than 4 gigabytes. But when we started actually tracking using this script, we found out that in the environment, it was getting up to about 5 or 6 gigabytes of use during that build. So you may need that option. So there are a number of tasks you may want to automate, but a lot of projects are going to start with some sort of push or deploy, moving code to some other environment or moving a build to another environment. So let's look at a few scenarios here. This is a pretty interesting one. Like for us, we have all of our code inside of Bitbucket, but a lot of people use GitHub for various things and for various reasons. And there may be a need for you to push to GitHub for collaboration with a client or a customer, or maybe there is some part of your code base that you want to be able to push out to a public repository, but you want to keep everything that you have in Bitbucket. This will allow you to do that. This script here simply adds a GitHub repository as a named remote and then pushes the main branch out to that remote. And if you want to get really fancy, you could even integrate a GitHub or a Git submodule into your Bitbucket super project. So you could have a submodule in your project that is a GitHub repository, but the super project is actually in Bitbucket. And so you can use your scripting inside of the pipelines to manage automatically updating GitHub every time you change your code locally, for example. Another thing that we do a lot, we use Firebase hosting for a lot of our projects. So to deploy to Firebase, one option for doing this is to use the built-in NPM command line tools for Firebase. So here we are installing those Firebase tools globally, and then we are going to run a script Firebase use and then the name of our Firebase project. So we'll have that as a variable, and Firebase use just says, hey, this is the specific Firebase project. If you only have one, it's not a big deal. I have like 30 Firebase projects, so I need to run this in front of every script to make sure that I've selected the one that I actually want to deploy to. And then I run the deploy step. And again, I have to provide an authentication token here on the command line in order for that step to run. But I can do this like I normally would. Like, this is basically how I would do it on my command line on my computer if I were going to deploy Firebase, and this works just fine. I would recommend when you do that npm install on the Firebase tools to specify the version here, because if you don't, you're going to end up with failing builds from time to time, as maybe they require a different npm version than the one that is in your pipeline image. You need to pay attention to stuff like that. So I generally recommend within your pipeline that you depend on things with specific version numbers, and then you can update that intentionally from time to time. But there's another way to do this, and that is that Bitbucket Pipelines provides a number of pre-built pipes. These pipes are essentially external scripts that run that do something for you. In this particular case, this is the Firebase deploy pipe. And we provided a couple of variables. You'll notice those variables look very similar. It's the same variables we had using the scripting approach. We're providing the authentication token, we're providing the project ID, and then this handles everything else you need to know. There's the advantage to this is that we don't have to install the Firebase command line tools every time, and that actually saves us a little bit of time. It's a little bit more performant inside of your pipelines. Another thing, we can deploy to Heroku. So this is something that I do sometimes. Some of our projects, we deploy servers to Heroku, and there's a few interesting things going on. So first, if we look at that bottom step down there at the bottom, we're using a pipe to deploy to Heroku. We're specifying the Heroku deploy pipe and then providing some variables, their API key name and the app name as variables, but also we're specifying a zip file, and that zip file is the contents of the archive that I want to deploy. And so I've actually produced that in an earlier step. So one of the things you can do in pipelines is have multiple steps. Now you can have one step that runs a lot of scripts, and that's generally the most efficient thing to do. But sometimes we may want to break it out into multiple steps. And the reason, the advantage is there is that it shows up very clearly which step broke. If something goes wrong in the pipelines, it shows you very clearly where things are in the process. And sometimes you really need to be able to break out those steps for various logical reasons. In this particular case, what I'm showing you is one of the ways to use the artifacts. So that first step creates an artifact. It is going to create a gzipped tar file from a variety of JavaScript files, and then produces an artifact, the server.tgz. That artifact then is going to get read by the next step. As you can tell, the zip file in question is server.tgz, and that was provided by the previous step. So this is one way to put various things together in order to do something a little bit more complex. And finally, another thing that happens a lot is you may want to publish to NPM. So if you're building a library, for example, a code library, maybe you want that out in NPM. We do a lot of JavaScript and TypeScript work, so this is pretty common. Any other type of repos, if you use Python, for example, you might want to push that up to some of the Python repos. You can do that here. So in this particular case, we're publishing to NPM. This is a production level deployment. We consider that this production deployment because it's going out for the world to use. So we run the install, the lint, the test. We're running our checks to make sure everything's good before it goes out. And then we run a build, and then we're using another pipe, which is the npm publish pipe. Definitely recommend using this pipe. Trying to publish to npm without this pipe is really pretty challenging. I've done a script-based approach, but I didn't like it very well and it was hard to maintain. So I definitely recommend using this. All you have to provide then is your NPM token to be able to publish to your NPM repository here. So this is another one that I find very useful for some of our projects. So that's how to do a lot of deployments. But sometimes we need to manage our own repository or pipeline within the pipeline task. We've got to do like internal pipeline management or a lot more complicated things. So one thing that we might want to be able to do is save the artifact. Now, as I mentioned before, artifact, when you specify, let me go back for a second. As you can see on here, the artifacts entry on the script, it shows everything under the lib folder is going to get saved. So presumably our build produces artifacts in that lib folder. Those are going to get saved. They're going to show up in the console for us to be able to go and download for 2 weeks. But we can't access those again. We can do it manually by logging into the console and downloading it, but we can't access it very easily via scripting. Also, because it's only there for 2 weeks, maybe we need something to persist a little bit longer or need to be able to share those with other people. So one way we can do that is through the save artifact. What I'm doing in this example is, again, creating a gzipped tar file. So I'm creating an archive of some files, in this case, the dist folder. And then I'm using a pipe to upload the file to Bitbucket. Now, that sounds funny because we're inside of Bitbucket, but what this actually does is it attaches that zip file or that tar file to your Bitbucket account in a specific shared archive location. What this means is that I can use the Bitbucket REST API to download this file in the future. And because Bitbucket has a REST API to be able to access this storage space, it means that I can use any sort of scripting on other platforms to access this artifact if necessary. Not even just inside of pipelines, but I can do it remotely as well. Turns out that's really useful. So this allows us to push that artifact up. And this is where it shows up. So inside of the cloud repository, we see our downloads place, and then we can have all of these different files available for download. We can manually delete them here. We can add files here, but whatever's here it's not publicly available. It requires authentication, right? You have to be authenticated to the account to be able to download these, but anybody can do it through the API with the right access tokens. So this is where that shows up inside of Bitbucket. This is how we can pull artifacts back from this space. Obviously, because this is a curl, we can technically do this from anywhere, but we can also do this inside of the Bitbucket pipeline scripts themselves. So the important bit here is that Bitbucket API endpoint and then our information. So whatever your company or username is, then the repository itself, followed by the downloads, which is all of the download spaces, and then the name of the thing we're downloading. And then you're going to have to provide your Bitbucket password in a netrc file. And this tells us, the -o tells us where we're going to save that file later. And then the next line is showing that I can now extract the contents of that file, because what I had done previously in the previous example, what I'm doing is I am zipping up everything in the dist folder. This is essentially going to reproduce the dist folder in the current running script. This actually allows me to run one pipeline to bundle up code and then run another pipeline later to retrieve that code. So for example, I can run a build in response to code changing, but then I can use that built code for other purposes later, which we're going to see here. So one thing we can do is build manual pipelines. So earlier I was showing how you can name your pipelines according to your branch names. This means that you can have a default pipeline that runs on all of your branches. You can specify individual branch names, so maybe your main branch, your release branch, and have different steps, different custom steps for those different branches. But in this case, this is a purely custom pipeline. In other words, it will never get run automatically. It will only get run if we manually try to run it inside of the pipeline console, or if we use the REST API to trigger the pipeline, which is another thing we can do. The other way you can run a manual pipeline is, if you remember, I showed inside of the console, there's a schedule button. You can schedule a manual pipeline to run on a regular basis. So this manual deploy looks a lot like some of the others. We're just going to deploy some static files. So in this particular case, one of the ways in which I use this is to use built code to do a secondary task. Because think of a website contains of two components, right? You have the code involved in building the website, and you have the content for the website. And so the content, in most cases, is going to change a lot more rapidly than the code is. So one way that I handle this is that when the code changes, I run a build, and then I save that built code out in Bitbucket. And then anytime the content changes, I use the latest build combined with the updated content to produce the final version of the website. So this allows us to do static rendering and that sort of thing. In this particular case, this is just showing doing a Firebase deploy. So if we have a custom pipeline, we may need to be able to trigger that from outside or from somewhere else. This is how we trigger a remote call pipeline from JavaScript. So this is just a simple function. We provide a URL to the REST endpoint, and then we have to provide a number of different details. So the details here is the target. What pipeline am I running? So the type there is provided as part of the API. There's a lot of different API triggers you can implement. This is a pipeline ref target. We're basically saying that I want to run a custom pipeline against a specific repository. So I'm going to give it the name of the repository, the name of the branch. I'm going to say this is a custom selector, and I'm going to give it the name of the pipeline that I'm running. And once I have all those things configured in the pipeline ref, I simply perform a post using whatever tool you're using. If you're in the browser, you can do this using fetch. If you're in the backend, maybe use a tool like Axios. You're simply going to post to that URL with those pipeline details, and you're going to provide some headers around the nature of that request. And that is how you do that remote pipeline call to actually trigger remote pipelines. So why would I ever do this? Well, again, you remember I said earlier that one of the ways in which I use pipelines is to do a multi-stage build for websites. So if I want to perform a content update on a static website and I need to do a render step, what I actually do, again, I'm in the Firebase environment, so I have a Firebase cloud function that triggers anytime the data changes inside the production environment. So if somebody's using a content management system, they publish data to the production environment, a cloud function responds to that, it grabs that trigger, and it says, okay, I have updated content. Now I need that Bitbucket pipeline to perform the render step. So it's going to use this code here to call that custom pipeline. That custom pipeline is going to download the archive of the latest version of the built code. It's then going to read the latest version of the content and perform the build. And this is the full step way of doing that. There's a lot of different really cool ways you can use this. There's a lot of use cases we've come up with where we want to be able to run a build periodically. And again, if you don't like using remote triggers, you can do that periodic schedule. Maybe you just want to run an update every 24 hours, once a day. You can totally do that. You can do that on a manual pipeline and move on really well. So that is all the different cool things that I have for you on Bitbucket pipelines. A lot of the interesting things that I've been able to do with it. I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions that you might have. These are the scenarios I came up with. Maybe you have your own scenarios. I'm happy to answer those questions and talk that over with you. If you would like to talk with me offline after the event, that QR code in the corner there is, or that URL, will allow you to set up a meeting with me. We can have a conversation about your specific situation. I'm happy to help you talk over Bitbucket pipelines or any of your DevOps needs. So thank you very much. Appreciate you being here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Michael. That was very educating. Lots of good examples. We got one question from Verena, and I think at the beginning you mentioned that you've been working with Jenkins before. Probably
Yeah,
that's a reason for the question as well. It
sure.
sounds. May I ask what is the difference between Bitbucket and Jenkins pipelines? And then if you can add a bit on advantages and disadvantages from your own experience.
Sure. I would say that Bitbucket pipelines are a lot easier to get up and running, and I love the fact that they are tightly integrated with the repository. So it's really, really, really easy to make changes or have things trigger based on changes in your repository. And I think just as importantly, it's a lot easier to update the configuration. So because the Bitbucket pipeline configuration lives inside of my repository and runs there, it is really, really easy for any developer on the team to make changes to that as necessary. Jenkins is really powerful and you can do just about anything with it, but I've always found that it is a little bit harder to get started with, and I have never successfully run Jenkins on a team that didn't have somebody kind of dedicated to managing Jenkins. I always felt that it was like a lot of overhead to keep it running, and Jenkins seems to a lot of the situations in which I've seen Jenkins used, it's doing a lot of scheduled jobs, which again, pipelines can do, but a lot less of the trigger-based work that the pipelines are doing a lot more easily. And it's simply because setting up the triggers, I always found that was a little bit harder to set up. But from that point on, they're both of them have the capability of running essentially any type of job you want to run. The biggest difference you're going to have with the types of jobs you can run is that Bitbucket pipelines are a little bit constrained by the environment. So as I mentioned, by default, it gets 4 gigabytes of operating memory. You can increase that to 8. If you need more than 8 gigabytes, you can, but it gets a little tricky. And in fact, you're probably going to end up having a conversation with the Bitbucket team about the best way to run your job in pipelines. You do have access to any Docker image, which is useful. I actually use a custom Docker image that provides Chrome so that I can run headless Chrome tests, for example. So, but there's no limitations there. But if you need to have a lot of control over the environment in which your stuff runs, right? Jenkins, you can install on any of your own servers, and you can have a lot more control over where the runtime of Jenkins and all of your jobs are. But then if you're using Jenkins, you kind of have to do that. Pipelines is completely managed by Bitbucket. I don't have to manage anything. I don't have to manage any servers. For my team, that works really well. We actually are 100% serverless. We don't have any instances of even a virtual machine anywhere that we have to manage. And I like that. But if that's not for your team, then Bitbucket is less of a good solution, perhaps, than something like Jenkins, where you have full control over that environment. I hope that helps answer your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Verena kind of adds a deeper question. Can you debug errors in the big Bitbucket pipelines if you're saying
Yep.
it's limiting a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So you get a lot of great details in the console. So if I go back really quickly, in fact, let me go back to an earlier view. So early on, I showed you like in here. So you have, when you expand through things in here in the console, you you can see all the things that happen, all the output that would happen if you ran this on the command line on your computer. All that output is actually going to be out there. And because of that, you have quite a lot of detail available to you for troubleshooting what's going on. And then if your problem is with like running tests provide additional details. If your problems are with a built artifact, you have the list of artifacts. You can download them and see what actually got generated. So there is a decent bit of detail here. And if you're having trouble, you can also, instead of having multiple scripts inside of a single step, you can break it out into individual steps. You can figure out which of my steps is breaking, and you get a lot of control over that. Additionally, I have found that if there is a problem where it seems to be with the pipeline environment itself, submit a ticket, and the Bitbucket team is really, really quick to respond and help kind of work through that. I actually had the situation that I mentioned earlier where I ended up not having enough memory. Initially, that was an intermittent problem because we were just kind of right at the threshold where sometimes the build would run. Essentially, it was a garbage collection timing. Sometimes it would run and we'd go over memory. Sometimes we would run and the garbage collection would happen fast enough that we didn't actually ever end up going over our memory allocation. And so for a while, it was sometimes we're out of memory, sometimes we weren't. And then as the project continued to grow, then we were always out of memory. And I worked back and forth with the Bitbucket team for quite a while, trying to understand what was happening with that memory situation. And that's why I show the memory scripts, because that's a super useful script. But the other thing to keep in mind with this, if we look at this memory output script, right? This is one example of being able to add metrics to your pipeline while it's running. There are lots of other types of scripts you can run. Again, this is a Linux node image. So if it's a Linux command that will print useful diagnostics out, you can use a script similar to this in your pipeline to really understand what's going on under the covers. So I would say there's quite a lot of opportunity to debug and troubleshoot on your own what's happening in your scripts.
Okay, thanks. And then there's Balas asking, is there a way where to find your code snippets? People would love to reuse those as well. Maybe those are available somewhere online.
Yeah. So I think they're available. They may actually be here available inside of Pine. I will make sure to upload those for everybody. I will also post a link on my Twitter account. So my Twitter account is here in the corner. If everybody's interested in seeing these slides, I'm more than happy to publish these for you.
Okay, thanks. Can't wait. And then Verena continues. Debugging in Jenkins is sometimes quite hard if you have big Java applications with a lot of dependencies. So you convinced Verena. We'll try to test out the Bitbucket pipelines. So well
Nice.
done.
Love it.
Yeah. I think you didn't share more about the Andromeda. I lost the name now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why Bitbucket? Why Andromeda? I assume you're using it
Yeah.
there. What's the scale? At what scale you are using it? Can you describe a little?
So we are a products company, so we have a lot of different digital products, both our own and for our clients. So we have, I don't know what the exact total is right now. We have about a dozen different products that are in various stages of life cycle, from early development all the way through mature applications that have been out for years. And we run all of our systems run in something that looks very much like this. So most of our products are deployed to either Firebase hosting or Heroku, some things to AWS. And we use this exact same system essentially for all of them. Some of those products are actually fairly large. in the grand scheme of things, in terms of like lines of code and everything else, and in terms of product maturity. But we do have a very small team. So right now we don't have hundreds of people in this code. We have a max of about 10 people working on different things. So the team is small, but we do have a lot of things going on.
Okay, thanks. Looking for more questions. Then one more from me.
Sure.
Probably I missed that throughout your presentation. I'm sorry if that's true. But then, what about a so-called commit gating or staged builds before the actual commit and configuration of that with a pipeline?
Yeah. So it kind of depends on how you want to do it. There's really two ways of breaking things out to stage them. One of them is, let's see here. There we go. You can do multi-step build where each step completely resolves before moving up onto the next step. So that is one way that you can do this. The other way, of course, is that you run a pipeline that produces an artifact. You push that artifact somewhere, and then you have a different pipeline that will run in response to a different trigger that will then pull that artifact back in to resume processing. And you would generally, the way that works is the initial artifact will get created in response to a change. In this case, this is the main branch you're seeing. But you may then also have a manual pipeline, one or more manual pipelines that will run in response to external triggers, timing, etc.
Okay, but then no native functionality of Bitbucket for such things, yeah?
I honestly don't know. It's not something that we do right now, and so it's not something that I've had to try to figure out.
Okay, thanks. I don't see more questions. I don't see additional messages in the chat. It seems that everyone has understood everything and everything is clear and everyone loves Bitbucket now. So expect people asking you questions offline.
That's great.
And then thank you, Michael. And let's get back to the big stage, the
Thank
keynote.
you all very much.
Thanks. Bye bye.